The rain no longer hurt. What burned was the cold that came from within. I was kneeling in the mud, with my hands shaking and my gaze lost, while his voice echoed behind me like a sentence that had already been decided long before that night. Nobody there saw me as someone who was still breathing for. I was already finished. I had already served. I could already be discarded. The taste of iron in my mouth, mixed with the smell of wet earth. I didn't clean up the blood. There was no reason. No one cared. They never cared. It was then that he said I still had one last chance. The word chance sounded wrong, heavy as if it were a poorly disguised lie. I raised my face slowly, feeling every muscle in my body protest, but my eyes were attentive. I needed to understand what was coming now. He spoke of the mission, said I needed to infiltrate, get closer, gain the trust of the Alpha King, and then destroy him from within my body. Remained still. But inside, something contracted. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was the recognition that this wasn't a mission. It was a slow execution. They didn't say his name. They didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was. The man who controlled entire territories without raising his voice. The one who made leaders avoid confrontation. The predator no one could predict. And I should get close to him, discover your weaknesses, surrender everything, and when the time came, make sure he fell. I didn't respond. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. There was no room for choice there. He moved closer, lowering his face until it was close to mine, as if he wanted to record every word inside my head. Said if I failed, no one would come after me. Said if I was discovered, it would be better to die quickly. Said if I refused, they would make sure to make my end worse than anything I could imagine. And at that moment, something inside me finally reacted. Anger. Not from the mission, not from danger, but the fact that even broken, even discarded, even though I was nothing to them, they still expected me to be useful. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, and when I opened them again, the decision was already made, not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because I had nothing left to lose. That's how it started. The journey to his territory took days. Each step seemed to pull me deeper into something I couldn't undo later. The trees grew denser, the air heavier. It was as if the place itself reacted to his existence. I heard stories on the way, whispers, from people who preferred to take huge turns just to not get close to that region. They said he was different, that he didn't need to prove anything, that his power simply existed. I didn't completely believe it. I had heard too many exaggerated stories in my life. But there, it was different. Silence wasn't just fear, it was respect. When I crossed the boundary of the territory, I felt it wasn't a sound, it wasn't a vision, it was pressure, something that made my body react. I even understood why I wasn't prepared, but I couldn't go back either. The first few days were observation. I moved carefully, avoiding attracting attention. I needed to learn how everything worked, who was close to him, where were the flaws. But there was a problem. Nothing seemed wrong. Everything was organized, accurate. Each person knew exactly what to do. There was no chaos, there was no carelessness, there was no weakness. And then I saw him. There was no announcement, no one drew attention, but everything changed. The bodies around them straightened up, the voices disappeared, the air became heavier. And he was there, stopped observing. I couldn't look away. His eyes moved slowly, analyzing everything, as if nothing was missing. When his gaze met mine, I felt my heart raced in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He showed no surprise, did not show recognition, but there was something there, something that made me freeze inside. He didn't say anything, just kept walking. But at that moment, I understood something that no one had warned me about. The danger was not just in him, it was what I was starting to feel, and this was much more dangerous than any mission. I tried to ignore the way my body reacted at that moment. I told myself it was just instinct, that anyone would feel that way when facing someone like him. But the truth was more uncomfortable. It wasn't just fear, it wasn't just respect, it was recognition, and it didn't make sense. I looked away before he could notice anything out of place. My role there hadn't really started yet. I was just another irrelevant presence in that territory, and it needed to stay that way. I spent the next few days observing every detail: who approached him, who avoided him, who spoke more than he should, who stayed silent. I needed to find a pattern, a flaw, anything that could be used, but the more. And as I watched, one more thing became clear. He didn't trust anyone. Not even those closest to him seemed to have real access to him. Interactions were short, direct, no space for emotional reading. It was as if he controlled not only the territory, but also the rhythm of everything around him, and that made my mission almost impossible. I couldn't just approach. There was no space for it. There were no social gaps. There were no distractions. There were no obvious opportunities. So I did what I always did. I waited. I waited for the moment when something got out of control. Because no matter how perfect everything seemed, there was always a moment of failure. There was always a moment where someone made a mistake. And when it happened, I was there. It was quick. One of the younger men in the group dropped a box while moving. The noise echoed louder than it should have, and in that place, the wrong noises attracted attention. The silence that followed was worse than any scream I saw when he appeared again. There was no rush in his steps. There was no expression of irritation, but the environment changed. Immediately, the young man who had dropped the box remained motionless. As if his own body had stopped reacting, I watched from afar. Keeping my position, but paying attention to every detail, he approached the boy and stopped. Right in front of him, nobody said anything. The boy tried to speak. He tried to explain, but his voice broke before he could form any complete sentence. And then something happened. It was not an immediate punishment. It was not violence. It was worse. He just looked a direct, cold, calculated look, and that was enough. The boy lowered his head, shaking, as if he had been crushed without anyone touching. After a few seconds that seemed much longer, he simply said that it couldn't happen again and left. It was just that. But the effect remained. I understood at that moment that his power didn't come from brute, came from control, absolute control, and that made everything even more dangerous. Because there was no impulsiveness to exploit, there was no uncontrolled anger, there was no visible emotional weakness. He was too stable. I needed to change strategy. If there wasn't a direct way to get closer, I would have to create I began to gradually insert myself into the most common activities, nothing that attracted it, just enough to become a known presence, someone that no one questioned because they were always there. It worked. Days later, some people no longer looked at me as strange. I listened to conversations. I picked up small pieces of information, nothing relevant yet, but enough to create a mental map of how that place works. Even so, he remained distant, untouchable, until something unexpected happened. I was helping with organizing supplies when I felt that same pressure stronger nearest before I even looked. I knew it was him. My body reacted first. It became rigid, alert. I slowly raised my face, and he was there, closer than before, much closer. His eyes passed over the people around him, evaluating each movement. When they reached, they didn't pass straight by this time. They stopped for a second too long. I felt like he was seeing more than he should. Like he was trying to understand something that I didn't even understand I didn't look away this time. Not immediately. It was a mistake. Or maybe not, because something changed there. Not around, but inside me. And then he did something that completely broke the pattern I had been observing since I arrived. He approached. Every step seemed calculated. No rush, no hesitation. Stopped in front of me, close enough that I felt his presence in an almost suffocating way. I held my breath without realizing, and then he spoke. He asked who I was. Simple, direct, but the weight of the question was much greater than its. Because in that moment, I understood that wasn't an approximation. It was a test, and any wrong answer could end it all before it even begins. Time seemed to slow down when he asked the question who I was, a simple question for anyone else. But there, in front of him, it carried the weight of a sentence. I knew I couldn't hesitate. Hesitation draws attention. Attention raises suspicion, and suspicion, in that place, didn't end well. But I also couldn't respond too quickly. Responses that are too ready sound rehearsed. I needed to find the exact point between natural and controlled. I took a slow breath, enough to steady my voice. I said that my name didn't matter much, that I was just another person trying to survive, that I had come from a territory that no longer existed as I spoke. I kept my gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just stable. He didn't react immediately. His eyes remained on me, analyzing every detail, as if he was taking apart every word I said. Looking for something out of place. The silence that formed was heavy. I could feel the people around, trying not to look directly but clearly paying attention. I couldn't make a mistake, so I added that I wasn't there to cause problems. I just wanted to work, be useful, not attract attention. It was almost ironic to say that while I was the center of his attention, but it was the role I needed to support. He tilted his head slightly, as if he was considering something, and then he asked another question. What territory did I come from? It squeezed something inside me, because there was no completely sure answer. Any territory mentioned could be verified. Any poorly constructed lie could be discovered, but telling the truth wasn't an option either. So I did what I learned to do to survive. I mixed the two. I named a real territory, one that had recently been destroyed, a place where few survived and even fewer remained organized enough to keep record. Said I ran away before the end was that I didn't look back. There was no need to completely lie when the truth was tragic enough. He was silent again, but this time, it was different. It didn't just feel like analysis. It seemed review, like he's trying to decide what to do with me. My body wanted to react, I wanted to prepare, I wanted to escape, but I kept my stance. If he perceived fear, he could interpret it as weakness. If he perceived too much confidence, he could interpret it as a threat. It was an impossible balance. And then, without warning, he did something I didn't expect. He took a step even closer. The distance between us has practically disappeared. I could feel the heat of his body, the subtle scent of his skin mixed with something stronger, wilder. My heart raced, but I didn't let it show. He lowered his face slightly, enough so that only I could hear what he said. He said I didn't smell like someone from that territory. The words were low, controlled, but full of certainty inside. Everything froze. I knew this could happen. I knew there were details that couldn't be completely controlled. But hearing that, in that direct way, it was different. I didn't respond right away, because any hasty response at that moment would be a mistake. So I did the only thing that could still work. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere anymore either. The answer did not deny, but it also didn't confirm. It was vague but true enough not to seem fabricated for a second. Something changed in his expression. Very subtle, almost imperceptible. But I saw, and that was the most dangerous thing. Because, for the first time, I wasn't just being analyzed, I was being considered. He moved away then, breaking the closeness that seemed to suffocate the air around him. But before leaving completely, he said I could stay. No explanation, no justification, just one decision. And that changed everything. Because in that territory, no one simply stayed. Everything was observed, everything was controlled. And yet, he decided I remained motionless for a few seconds after he left. Not by choice, but because my body was still trying to understand what had just happened. The people around them slowly started moving again, as if they were coming out of a state of forced pause. But now, the looks were different, more attentive, more curious. I had stopped being invisible, and that was a problem because being invisible was what kept me safe. Now, any wrong movement could be observed, any detail out of place could be questioned, and worst of all, he now knew I existed that night. I couldn't sleep. I lay there, looking at the ceiling, replaying every second of that encounter in my head. The words, the looks, the way he noticed something I tried to hide. That wasn't normal. He wasn't normal. And the more I thought, the more a feeling grew inside me. It wasn't fear, not completely. It was something more complicated. Something I couldn't allow. Because the closer I got to him, it would be harder to remember why I was there. And for the first time since I accepted that mission, I felt doubt, not about surviving, but about being able to do what needed to be done. I didn't like the feeling of doubt. Doubt was failure. Failure was death. I learned this long before I got there, still lying there, with my eyes open in the dark. I forced my mind to return to what mattered, the mission, the goal, the reason I had accepted this. He was the target. Nothing more, but the more I repeated this, the more his image came back. The attentive gaze, the way he noticed something no one had ever noticed before, the way he approached without hesitation, as if there was no possible threat, a keel I didn't fit in with. The men I knew, men of power, usually shouted, showed strength, tried to command respect he didn't need, and that was what made everything more dangerous in the following days. I needed to adjust everything. The way I walked, the way I spoke, the way I looked. Now, I was no longer invisible. I was observed, and not just for others. For him, I started to notice different patterns. People who previously ignored my presence now measured every word when I was around some, avoided others, approached carefully, as if trying to understand what I was, but no one asked directly. No one there seemed willing to challenge his decision. It gave me an advantage if he had allowed me to stay. It put me in a position I didn't yet fully understand. but it was a position that could be used. I started to move more freely, but without exaggeration. I participated more in activities. I listened to more conversation. I observed more attentively, and little by little, the information began to fall into. He didn't lead like others. There were no unnecessary punishments. There were no public displays of power to intimidate, but there was also no room for error. Everything worked because everyone knew they couldn't fail, not out of fear of violence, but for fear of disappointing. This was new to me, and because it made it harder to find a point of attack. There was no internal revolt. There was no visible dissatisfaction. There were no people wanting to overthrow him. On the contrary, they were loyal. And true loyalty is much harder to break. I needed to get closer, but I couldn't force it, so I waited. I observed the schedules, the movements, the moments when he appeared and disappeared, the few interactions he had with others, until you realize something he always did: inspections alone, without escort, without warning, and those were the only times he wasn't surrounded. It was risky, but it was the only real opportunity. The next day, I positioned myself on the path he to take on one of the inspections, not in an obvious way, just enough to cross him naturally, or at least look natural. When I felt that presence again, my body reacted before my mind, as always, but this time, I was ready. I continued what I was doing. I didn't look immediately. I didn't stop. I let him notice me first, and it was I felt the gaze before I even looked up. When I finally looked, he was already standing still, observing. Once again, silence formed around. Even with no one around, it was as if the very space around him worked different. I gave a small nod, enough respect not to seem defiant, but not submission. He did not respond to the gesture, just got closer. This time, there was no immediate question. He stopped next to me, looking at what I was doing, organizing. Nothing important but useful, always useful. I waited because I knew he didn't talk for no reason. And then he said, "I moved like someone who had already been trained." That hit me more directly than the previous question, because it wasn't a vague assumption. It was an accurate observation. I continued with what I was doing for a second longer than necessary, long enough to think denying would be useless, confirming would be dangerous. So I chose another path, said that surviving requires quick learning, that those who don't learn don't last. It wasn't a direct answer, but it also wasn't evasive enough to seem suspicious. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he did something unexpected. Took one of the tools from my hand. The touch was quick, but firm. I felt the difference immediately. The way it held, the precision, the control. He adjusted something I had done, small, almost imperceptible, but better, and then returned without looking directly at me, but before leaving. He said that in that territory, surviving was not enough. You had to be better than others, and left. I stood still for a few seconds, looking at the tool in my hand. That wasn't just a correction, it was a warning, and maybe an invitation. The problem was that I didn't know which of the two was more dangerous, because the more he talked to me, it became harder to maintain the distance I needed, and the closer I got to something that could destroy not only the mission, but everything I still thought I controlled inside of me. I stared at the tool for longer than I should have, not because of the adjustment he made, but because of the ease with which he entered my space. Noticed a minute detail, and left as if it were completely natural. That wasn't normal. Nobody did this to me. No one could come so close without provoking an immediate reaction, without arousing distrust, without activating defense. But with him, it was different, and it pissed me off. By that meant I was losing control. In the following days, I started to notice something that wasn't in my plan. He appeared near me more often, never directly, never obviously, but always enough for me to feel. Sometimes it was just the presence, that silent pressure that made the environment change. Other times, it was the quick look, evaluating, as if he was following something that only he understood. I needed to turn that into an advantage. If he was paying attention to me, then I could use that. I began to adjust my behavior in subtle ways, not enough to seem forced, but enough to convey what he saw. More precise movements, more controlled responses, minimum errors. Calculated, I let little flaws slip when I knew he was around. Nothing big, nothing that would catch the attention of others, but enough for him to notice. And he realized always, and I always corrected, without attracting attention, without exposing it, was almost instructive. It started to change the way others saw me. Some started to observe me more carefully. Others started to keep their distance, as if they didn't want to get involved with something they didn't yet understand. But there was a moment that changed everything. One of the oldest men in the territory started testing me. I noticed at first glance he did not speak directly, but he asked indirect questions, loose comments, situations that required a quick response. He was trying to understand who I was, and more than that, why had he let me stay? I kept control, answer only what is necessary, never too much, never too little. But he didn't seem satisfied, and then he did something more direct, created a situation during a group activity. He changed an order without warning, something simple. But it affected the work sequence. Most didn't notice, but I realized, and that was exactly what he wanted if I ignored it. It would show lack of attention if I corrected it. It would draw attention. It was a trap. I chose to act. I corrected it, trying to maintain the natural flow, but it was enough. He interrupted everything. His voice cut through the room, demanding an explanation. Everyone stopped, everyone looked, and for the first time since I arrived, I was in the spotlight, in a negative way. He asked who had authorized the change. I knew it was directed at me. If I told the truth, it would create direct conflict. If you lied, you could be discovered. If I stayed silent, I would look guilty before I could respond. He took another step. He said that in that territory, no one acted on their own. The weight of the words was clear. It was a challenge. I felt the atmosphere become tense. The people around me avoided looking directly, but they were completely focused. I opened my mouth to respond, but I wasn't the one who said it. The presence came before the voice, and when he spoke, everything changed. Said the order was correct, simple, direct, no explanation. The man in front of me froze for a second, and that was enough, because in that territory, his word was not questioned. Never. The man immediately backed away, lowering his head in acceptance. The tension disappeared as quickly as it came, but the impact remained. I didn't move. I didn't look at him right away. But I felt he was there nearby, once again changing the course of something that could have exposed me. And that was a problem, because it wasn't part of the plan. I finally looked up. He was already watching me. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't just analysis. It was a decision, and it made something inside me tighten, because protection never came without a price. And the way he watched me, I had the feeling that, somehow, I had already started to pay. I knew it wouldn't go unnoticed. Nothing in that territory past his intervention had been to direct, to clear. He didn't just prevent me from being exposed. He took a side, and that inside meant more than protection. It meant choice. In the days that followed, the environment changed in a way that couldn't be ignored. People didn't talk to me in the same way. Some avoided me completely. Others watched from afar, as if they expected me to make some mistake big enough to justify the discomfort I was causing. But no one got too close. No one wanted to come between me and him. And that was dangerous, because the more isolated I became, the more evident it became that I didn't belong there. I needed to regain my balance, back to being just another. But that wasn't just up to me anymore. He kept appearing, always at the wrong time, always close enough to interfere without looking like you were interfering. It was calculated. I need and uncompletely out of my. I started avoiding the paths I knew I adjusted my schedule. I changed my life. The routes I started working in more remote areas. It worked for a while, until it stopped working, because he found me anyway. I was in a more isolated part of the territory, organizing some equipment that almost no one used. It was a quiet place, safe, or at least I thought it was, until I feel that presence again this time. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate, strong, as if the air had been suddenly pulled in. I didn't need to look to know it was him, but I looked anyway. He was standing at the entrance, watching. Didn't seem angry, but he didn't seem satisfied either. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was loaded. I continued what I was doing for a few seconds, trying to maintain some sort of normalcy. But he didn't leave, didn't move. It just stayed there. So I stopped. I looked up and I waited. He walked towards me with the same calmness as always. Firm steps, no rush, no hesitation, stopped closer than anyone else would have had the courage to stop. and then asked why I was avoiding. The question was too direct. No room for interpretation, no easy way out. My body reacted before my mind, a slight tightening of the muscle, an automatic alert, but I kept my expression neutral, said he wasn't avoiding it, that I was only working where I needed to. He didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on me, as if he was waiting for me to retract my words. And for a second, I almost did it, but I held on because I couldn't lose control now, so I added that in that place. The less attention I attracted, the better it was. True, but it wasn't the whole truth. He took another step. The distance between us has practically disappeared. And then he said something that made everything inside me. Said I already attracted enough attention, and that running away from it wouldn't change anything. The tone was not aggressive, but he wasn't kind either. It was definitive, as if he was stating something that had already been decided. I felt my heart speed up, but I kept my gaze steady. I asked why it mattered. The question came out firmer than I expected, but it was too late to back down. He didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, for the first time, something like interest appeared more clearly in his expression. He tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing not just the question, but the intent behind it. And then he replied. He said that in that territory, nothing that catches attention goes unnoticed, and that he didn't ignore what he didn't understand. That wasn't just an answer, it was a confession. He was watching me more than I had imagined, more than I wanted. The silence returned. But this time it was different, heavier, more intimate. I could feel every detail of his presence. Controlled breathing, the firm stance, the way he effortlessly occupied space, and the worst, the way my body reacted to it. I needed to regain control now before it was too late. So I took a small step back. Subtle but intentional, creating space distance, he realized. Of course you noticed, but it didn't move forward, just watched, and that was even more disconcerting because he let me create distance. Like I was testing how far I would go or waiting for me to come back. I broke the silence, said it wasn't his problem, that I posed no threat, that he didn't need to worry about me. The words came out firmly subsidiaries, but inside, I knew it was an attempt to push away something that was already. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he said something that changed everything. He said the threat wasn't what worried him, it was the way he spoke. Calm down, right as if I was seeing something that I didn't yet have the courage to face. And before I could respond, he turned around and went away without looking back, but leaving something in the air, something I couldn't ignore, because at that moment, I understood the danger was no longer just the mission. It was the fact that he had already begun to cross barriers that I had spent my entire life building, and I didn't know if I could still stop it. I stood still for a few seconds after he left, not because I wanted to, but because my body was still trying to understand what had just happened. He wasn't interested in threat. So what was the question stuck in my mind? Repeating uncomfortably as I began to move again, trying to regain whatever sense of normalcy I had left. But there was no more normality. I felt it in every look I received, in every silence that formed when I passed by, every subtle change in the behavior of the people around me, and the worst, I felt it inside me. Something's changing, and I had no control over it that night. The air was colder than normal. I moved away from the main areas, more looking for a place where I could think without interruptions. I needed to organize everything separate, what was a mission from what was something else. But before I could even clear my mind, I heard a non-standard sound, bass, fast, wrong. My body reacted instantly, all my senses adjusted, focusing on the direction of the noise. It wasn't someone moving normally, it was someone trying not to be heard, and that was never a good sign. I approached carefully, keeping the weight of my steps distributed, avoiding branches, dry leaves, anything that could give away my position. When I finally managed to visualize the source of the sound, my stomach tightened. Two men, one of them, the same one who had tested me a few days ago, the other one, I didn't know well, but I wasn't part of the main group. They weren't talking, they were hiding something. I stayed in the shadows, watching, trying to understand before I acted, but I didn't need much time. Loose words started to make sense. Informations, movements. They were collecting data about the territory, about him. My heart slowed down, not for calm, but by focus. That was exactly the kind of thing I should be doing, and yet I wasn't. Another person was, and didn't seem loyal. I should get out of there. Ignore it. Wasn't my place to interfere. My mission was different, but my feet didn't move, because something inside me didn't let me. They started moving, probably to get out of there before anyone noticed. That's when I stepped on a branch. The sound was low, but enough the two stopped silence. I didn't have time to back down. Their gaze met mine, and in that moment, everything changed. The man who was already suspicious of me immediately narrowed his eyes. There was no surprise there. There was recognition, as if that was just confirmation of what he already suspected. He took a step towards me. He asked what I was doing there. The tone was not high, but it was threatening. I maintained the posture, said I heard a strange sound and came to check, simple, direct. But he didn't believe I saw it in his eyes. He took another step. Closer, he said. I had a habit of showing up where I wasn't called. This was no longer a conversation. It was an accusation. The other man remained silent, watching, clearly waiting for the outcome. I knew it could escalate quickly, very fast, if they decided I was a problem. I would have no advantage there, so I did the only thing that could still give me a chance. I kept my gaze steady and said that in that territory, anything out of the norm should be observed, and hiding information was exactly the kind of thing that attracted attention. The silence that followed was tense, heavy. I was playing a dangerous game, turning the tide, but I didn't know if it would be enough. The man in front of me clenched his jaw slightly, and for a second, I thought he was going to move forward, but then the presence stronger than before, more intense. The air changed almost violently. The two men froze, and I didn't have to look to know. He was there when I finally turned around. He was already standing a few steps behind, observing, but this time there was no neutrality. There was something more, something colder, most dangerous. His eyes passed over the two men slowly, and they stopped. The silence was absolute. Nobody moved, no one breathed loudly, and then he spoke. He asked what was happening, simple but loaded with authority. The man in front of me tried to respond, tried to control the situation, but the voice didn't come out the way he wanted. Weak, unstable. I didn't say anything, didn't need, because in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. I wasn't the only one there with secrets, and he had already started to realize that. To the way he looked at me after that, it wasn't surprising. It was confirmation, like every piece is starting to fall into place. And that made everything even more dangerous, because the closer he got to the truth, less space I had to hide mine. The silence that formed after his question was not empty. It was pressure dense enough to make anyone there give in. I felt it in the bodies of the two men in front of me. Their posture changed. Their breathing became shorter. Their gaze, which before tried to confront me, now avoided his. He didn't repeat the question, didn't need the man who had confronted me to step back. Almost imperceptibly, as if trying to reorganize his control before speaking, he said they were just checking movements outside, that they had heard something strange, and decided to investigate. The same excuse I used. The difference was that mine sounded natural. His, no. I didn't need to look at the Alpha King to know. He noticed, but still, I looked, and what I saw made me hold my breath for a second. He doesn't showed irritation, no doubt just watched, but there was something there, something sharper, as if he already knew the answer before the question was asked. His eyes moved from one man to the next, analyzing, dismantling any attempt at control they still felt they had. And then he did something that completely changed the situation, ignored the explanation. Just like that, as if it had no value, as if it wasn't even worth considering, he took a few steps forward, approaching the... His presence was now suffocating. I could feel it in my own skin, but the effect on others was even clearer. The second man, the one who had been silent until then, looked away first. A small but revealing gesture. Weakness, error, and in that territory, mistakes did not pass. The Alpha King stopped right between us. The position was not random. He positioned himself in such a way that he controlled every angle, every possible movement. Nothing escaped. Then he spoke again. He asked who had authorized that check. Direct, no room for deviation. The man tried to respond. He said he didn't think it was necessary to bother with something small. Biggest mistake I saw at the moment he spoke. The Alpha King's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The kind of detail few would notice, but I noticed because I was paying attention to him too much. The silence that came after was heavier than the previous one. There was no longer any doubt about what was happening. This wasn't just a conversation. It was judgment. And then he turned his face slightly for me. The movement was subtle, but enough to completely change the focus of the situation. His eyes met mine, and for a second, Everything around disappeared. There were no longer the other two. There was no longer the environment. Just that look, intense, deep. Like it's breaking through everything I tried to hide. And then he did something no one expected. He asked what I had heard. The question was directed at me, not to them. To me, that changed everything, because now the situation no longer depended solely on them. It depended on me. I felt the immediate weight of choice. If I talked too much, I would expose myself. If I spoke less, I could appear conniving. If he lied, he might realize, and I wasn't sure how far his perception went, but I knew one thing: he was already suspicious. Not just theirs, from me too. I took a deep breath, controlling every detail of my expression before responding. Said I heard unusual movement, that I followed the sound, and I found them both there, without adding anything else. Without accusing, without defending, just the facts. Silence returned. But this time, different, more targeted, more accurate. The Alpha King didn't take his eyes off me right away, as if I were evaluating not just the words, but the way I said them, the rhythm, the breath, everything. And then he turned back to the other. To the decision came quickly. He said that type of initiative would not be repeated. His voice didn't rise, but the impact was immediate. They both lowered their heads at the same time. Complete submission, no question, no resistance. He did not impose punishment there, but he made it clear that it didn't end at that moment. And then he did something even more unexpected, told them to leave now. Without looking back, they obeyed immediately. They left too quickly for those who, seconds before, were trying to maintain control. And then there's just the two of us left. Silence returned. But now, it was different, closer, more intimate. I could feel his gaze on me again, heavier, more direct. No distraction, no interference. I maintained the posture, but inside, everything was on alert. Because now, there was no one else to share his attention, and that made everything much more dangerous. He took a step towards me, slow, controlled, and stopped close enough for any movement of mine to be noted. Then he spoke, said I was in the wrong place, but at the right time. The words hung in the air for a second. I didn't respond right away, because that wasn't just an observation, it was a statement, loaded with meaning. And the way he looked at me, he wasn't just talking about that situation, he was talking about me. And for the first time, I had a clear feeling that he wasn't just starting to get suspicious, he was starting to understand. His words stuck in the air in a way I couldn't ignore. Wrong place, right time. This wasn't about the two men who had just left. It was about me. I felt my body react, a silent warning coursing through every part of me. He was too close to the truth, too close to what I couldn't let slip. But at the same time, there was something else there, something that didn't fit with pure suspicion. I held his gaze, even though I knew it was risky. I asked what he wanted to say. With that, my voice came out steady, controlled. But inside, I was measuring every possible response he could give. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved slowly across my face, as if analyzing not just the question, but what I was trying to hide behind it. And then he said, I always showed up where I shouldn't, that I saw things that most people didn't notice, that I reacted before others understood what was happening. His every word was precise, direct, and dangerous, because he wasn't guessing, he was describing. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Said surviving taught me to pay attention, that ignoring detail is usually costly. He tilted his head slightly, as if that answer had any value. But not enough. He took another step now. There was practically no space between, and it was at that moment that everything changed. I felt it before I even understood a connection, strong, violent, as if something inside me had suddenly been pulled. My breath hitched for a second. My entire body reacted, and I saw in his eyes he also felt. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't an impression, it was real. His look changed, not completely, but enough that absolute control that I had been observing since the beginning had a flaw, small but undeniable, and that was scarier than anything else so far. Because I knew what that meant, even though I don't want to admit it. I took a step back, instinctive, creating distance, trying to break whatever had happened, but it was too late. He had already realized. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in threat, but in recognition. And then he spoke base, but of course, said it wasn't possible. The sentence was short, but loaded, and in that moment, I understood he wasn't talking to me, he was talking to himself. confirming something he didn't expect, that he didn't want. My heart started to beat faster. But it wasn't fear, not completely. It was something deeper, most dangerous, because that changed everything. If he understood what was happening, if he connected the dots, I would no longer be able to hide anything. I needed to act now, before it was too late. So I did the only thing that could still create doubt. I denied. Not with words, but with attitude. I took another step away. I broke eye contact. I took a deep breath, as if it didn't mean anything, as if it were just the tension of the moment, and then said he was misinterpreting, that it was nothing. My voice was firm, but I knew he also knew. That didn't convince. The silence that came after was unlike any other. It wasn't just tense, it was filled with something neither of them were willing to say out loud. He didn't come closer this time, didn't try to close the distance again, but he didn't move away completely either. It stayed there, observing, processing, as if I was rearranging everything I knew until now. And that scared me more than any direct confrontation, because he wasn't impulsive. He thought, he analyzed, and when I made a decision, didn't go back. Finally, he broke the silence, said I should be careful, not as a threat, but as a warning, and then turned around. But before leaving completely, he stopped for a brief second without looking at me, and said something that made my whole body freeze. He said that if that was what he was thinking, nothing there would stay the same, and went away. The sound of his footsteps slowly disappeared, but the effect remained heavy, stuck in the air inside me. I remained still, trying to regain control of my breathing, my thoughts, everything, but there was no longer complete control. Because now it wasn't just the mission that was at risk. It was something much bigger, something I was sent to destroy. But at that moment, it was already starting to destroy me first. I stayed there longer than I should have, feeling the echo of his words still reverberating inside me. Nothing there would remain the same. That wasn't an empty warning, it was a certainty. And for the first time since I set foot on that terrain, I wasn't just thinking about the mission, I was thinking about him, in the way he reacted, in the failure that I saw, in the connection that neither of them could deny. That wasn't part of the plan, never did, and that was exactly why it was so dangerous. I forced my body to move. I couldn't just stand there, stuck in that moment. The longer I thought, the harder it would be to maintain control. I went back to the main area, trying to look normal, maintaining the rhythm, the posture, the breathing, but inside, everything was out of place, and it didn't take long for me to realize that something had already changed. People were quieter, more tense, the looks more careful. The news spread not in direct words, but in behavior. No one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone knew something had happened. And in that territory, changes like that never went unnoticed. I kept moving, doing what needed to be done, but my attention was elsewhere. In it, trying to anticipate the next move, trying to understand what he would do now that he knew, because he knew, I was sure of that. And then I felt that presence stronger than ever, but this time, different. There was just no control. There was tension. I turned my face slowly, and I found him standing in the center of the space, with everyone around in absolute silence. But it wasn't the usual silence, it was expectation. Something was about to happen. His eyes passed by everyone, but stopped on me direct, without deviating, no hiding. And then he spoke, said there was something that needed to be resolved. His voice was firm, cold, but loaded with something I hadn't seen before: decision. The entire room seemed to freeze. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and then he continued. He said there was treason within the territory. The words were like a direct impact, subsidiaries, but heavy, and in that instant, I knew this wasn't just about the two men. It was bigger, much bigger. He took a step forward, and the simple movement made everyone instinctively recoil. Minus me. I couldn't. My body just didn't respond. And that got even more attention. His eyes never left me, not for a second. And then he did what I feared most. He began to expose no names, not yet, but facts. Suspicious movements, leaked information, details that should not have been noticed by an outsider. He was putting everything together, piece by piece, in front of everyone, and every word of his tightened the space around me, because I knew I was part of that, even if it wasn't the only one. Even if it wasn't the main, I was involved. The silence around became suffocating. People began to exchange discreet glances, distrust, fear, and then he stopped. For a second too long, and finally he said that he already knew where the fault came from. My heart raced, but I didn't move. I didn't breathe deeper. Nothing I knew that any reaction could give me away. And then he did something no one expected. He called the two men from the night before. They were brought to the front quickly, visibly tense, without the same posture as before. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need, just looked, and that was enough. One of them broke. First started talking fast, uncontrolled, trying to defend yourself, trying to justify, but in the middle of the words, something came out, something that shouldn't. A name, one contact, and an order. The order to approach him, to watch, to find weakness. The same type of mission I had received. The air seemed to disappear, but then came the part I didn't expect. He didn't look at me with accusation. Not immediately. He looked at the two men and said that betrayal wasn't the worst mistake. The worst mistake was underestimating who he was, and before anyone could react, he acted fast. I need final. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, irreversible. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak, and then he looked at me direct. No hiding, without a doubt, but also no immediate condemnation. And that was the most unexpected of all. He approached step by step until you're in front of me again. The same distance, the same presence, but now everything was different. He slightly lowered his face and said something that changed everything. Said he knew I wasn't like them. The phrase hit me directly because it meant he knew, but not everything. Not yet. He continued. Said I had two choices, but he didn't explain what they were. Didn't need, because the way he looked at me, I understood, or I kept hiding. Or would I start to tell the truth? And for the first time since I accepted that mission, I didn't know which of the two options was more dangerous, because any of them, it would change everything.